Most people imagine manipulation as something visible. A person pushes, insists, persuades, or pressures until you finally give in. That version of influence exists, but it is crude. It exposes intent, it creates friction, it invites resistance. And resistance is the one thing intelligent manipulators try to avoid. The tactic used by sharper minds does not feel like control. It feels like space. It feels like someone letting you think for yourself. It feels like respect for your independence. That is exactly why it works. The human brain is built to detect force, not design. When someone pushes you, your mind instinctively pushes back. When someone argues too hard, your defenses activate. When someone appears emotionally invested in convincing you, you begin searching for their motive. But when someone steps back and removes pressure, your guard drops almost immediately. You assume there is nothing to defend against. This is the moment where subtle manipulation begins. Instead of trying to change your decision, the intelligent manipulator changes the conditions in which your decision forms. They do not confront your reasoning, they shape the environment your reasoning operates inside. By the time you arrive at a conclusion, it feels self-generated, it feels logical, it feels like something you chose freely. What you do not see is how carefully the path was cleared before you walked it. People like to believe their thoughts originate entirely from within. This belief protects identity. It reinforces the sense of being in control of one's life. But in reality, decisions rarely form in isolation. They emerge from context, from what information appears visible, from what emotional tone surrounds the situation, from which options seem acceptable and which never even enter consideration. Whoever shapes these elements holds quiet influence over the outcome. The manipulator does not need to persuade you if they can control what feels reasonable to you. This is the invisible lever. Adjust the structure around the mind, and the mind will adjust itself. Your brain prefers internal consistency above almost anything else. It wants to believe your choices make sense. It wants to feel rational. When an idea appears to arise naturally from your own thinking, you protect it. You defend it, you attach it to a sense of identity. But when the same idea is pushed on you externally, you question it, you search for hidden motives, you resist even if the idea itself is valid. Smart manipulators never fight this instinct, they work with it. They do not attempt to insert thoughts directly into your mind. Instead, they quietly remove anything that would have led your thoughts somewhere else. They narrow the field of possibilities without you noticing it narrowing. What remains feels like the obvious conclusion, and once your brain labels something obvious, it rarely questions how it became that way. This is why subtle manipulation feels indistinguishable from normal decision-making. There is no visible struggle, no emotional confrontation, no dramatic turning point. You simply feel as if you arrived somewhere on your own. You can observe this process in ordinary interactions if you look closely enough. A manager never orders you to take responsibility for something. Instead, they mention your reliability, hint at how important the task is, and remain silent afterward. No command is given, no pressure is applied, yet the structure of the situation shifts. Declining now feels inconsistent with how you see yourself. Accepting feels natural, so you accept. From your perspective, you made a personal decision. From their perspective, the outcome was predictable the moment they framed the situation. This form of influence is efficient because it transfers the effort of persuasion onto you. You supply the reasoning, you supply the justification, you supply the commitment. The manipulator only arranges the conditions. Once you understand this, a colder realization begins to form. The strongest control rarely comes from domination, it comes from invisibility. When influence feels like freedom, it becomes almost impossible to resist. This is the foundation of the tactic. Before pressure, before persuasion, before any visible attempt to control you, there is something quieter, the shaping of the ground you stand on. And most of the time, you never notice it happening. Once the environment around you has been shaped, the manipulator's work is mostly finished. What happens next is carried out by your own mind. This is the part people rarely understand. The most effective manipulation is self-executing. The target becomes the one who finishes it. The human brain constantly searches for meaning, patterns, and consistency. It does not like ambiguity, and it does not like leaving situations unresolved. When you are placed inside a carefully structured context, your mind automatically begins filling in the gaps. You interpret tone, assign motives, evaluate options, and predict outcomes. All of this happens internally, without anyone needing to guide you step by step. A skilled manipulator relies on this automatic process. They do not explain everything. They do not spell out what they want. Instead, they leave just enough information for your brain to construct the rest on its own. Because when your mind generates the conclusion, it feels more convincing than anything another person could say to you directly. This is why indirect influence is so powerful. Direct persuasion feels external. Self-generated reasoning feels personal. Once a conclusion feels personal, you defend it as if it were part of your identity. You can see this mechanism in how people interpret silence. If someone gives you a clear instruction, your reaction is straightforward: accept it or reject it. But if someone stays quiet in a moment where you expect guidance, your mind starts working. You wonder what they are thinking. You imagine what they might prefer. You analyze what choice would make sense in their eyes. Without realizing it, you begin aligning your behavior with an expectation they never openly expressed. The manipulator does not need to say anything because your mind is already doing the labor of interpretation. This effect becomes stronger when uncertainty is mixed with subtle signals. A slight nod, a neutral expression, a carefully timed pause. These are enough for your mind to begin constructing meaning. Humans are extremely sensitive to social cues. When cues are incomplete, the mind does not stop processing. It increases effort. It searches harder. It fills the silence with assumptions. And assumptions are easier to guide than decisions. Once your mind starts building explanations, it naturally tries to keep them consistent with how you see yourself. If you believe you are responsible, you lean toward responsible actions. If you believe you are loyal, you lean toward loyal behavior. If you believe you are rational, you lean toward what appears logically justified. The manipulator only needs to arrange the situation so that the path they want aligns with one of your self-images. At that point, you move willingly. This is why intelligent manipulators rarely challenge your identity directly. They do not try to force you into behavior that contradicts how you see yourself. Instead, they frame the situation so the behavior they want feels like proof of who you already believe you are. If you see yourself as dependable, they create a context where stepping in feels like confirming that identity. If you see yourself as independent, they create a context where agreeing with them feels like your own conclusion. If you see yourself as perceptive, they create a context where noticing their subtle hints feels like insight. In every case, your self-concept becomes the engine that drives you toward their outcome. What makes this tactic especially effective is that it removes the emotional signature of manipulation. There is no visible coercion, no argument, no pressure. You do not feel controlled because the movement originates inside your own reasoning process.
but the direction of that movement was never random. This dynamic has been observed repeatedly in studies of decision-making and social behavior. People rarely evaluate every possible option objectively. Instead, they rely on what feels salient, appropriate, or internally consistent. Once the environment highlights certain interpretations and dims others, the mind gravitates toward the highlighted path automatically. The manipulator's role is not to force the step, it is to light the path. By the time you act, the decision feels settled. You may even feel confident in it. If someone asked you why you chose that direction, you could explain it clearly. Your reasoning would sound coherent and logical, and you would believe every word of it. That is the final piece of the mechanism. When you can explain your decision to yourself, you stop questioning how it formed. The manipulator disappears from the equation. The influence leaves no visible trace. All that remains is your conclusion, which now feels like it always belonged to you.
Before your mind ever begins constructing a decision, something more fundamental has already happened. The situation itself has been framed. This is where the real control sits, not in what you choose, but in what feels available to choose. Framing is the quiet architecture of perception. It determines what appears important, what seems risky, what feels acceptable, and what never even enters your awareness. Most people assume they are reacting to reality directly, but they are almost always reacting to a version of reality filtered through context. The intelligent manipulator understands that whoever defines the frame defines the outcome. They do not argue over the decision, they arrange the scene in which the decision will occur. They emphasize certain facts while leaving others unspoken. They introduce timing that makes one option feel urgent and another feel impractical. They shape the emotional tone so that one direction feels stable while another feels uncomfortable. By the time you begin consciously thinking, the field of possibilities has already been narrowed. You rarely notice this narrowing because the human brain prefers simplicity. Too many options create cognitive strain. When a situation appears to offer one clear, reasonable path, the mind feels relief. That relief is mistaken for certainty. You interpret the absence of confusion as evidence that the decision is obvious. But often, the decision only feels obvious because the frame was carefully built. Consider how easily perception shifts depending on what is emphasized first. If a conversation begins by highlighting risk, your thinking becomes defensive. If it begins by highlighting opportunity, your thinking becomes expansive. If it begins by emphasizing responsibility, you evaluate choices through a moral lens. If it begins by emphasizing efficiency, you evaluate them through a practical one. The underlying options may not change, but the meaning attached to them does, and meaning determines behavior far more than facts alone. A skilled manipulator rarely floods you with information. Too much detail invites scrutiny. Instead, they select just enough elements to guide your interpretation. They allow you to assume the rest. Once your mind fills in the missing pieces, the frame feels complete, even though it was built from fragments. This is why subtle influence often feels indistinguishable from normal conversation. Nothing overtly controlling happens. No command is issued. No argument is forced. Yet the emotional and logical structure of the situation quietly shifts until one outcome feels natural and the others feel distant or irrational. You move toward the path that feels natural, rarely noticing that natural was engineered. The power of framing lies in how early it operates. By the time you are aware of making a decision, the important work is already done. You are not choosing between equal possibilities. You are choosing between interpretations that were prepared in advance.
Once this preparation is complete, persuasion becomes unnecessary. Your own reasoning does the rest. This is why highly intelligent manipulators prefer shaping first impressions, emotional tone, and perceived stakes rather than engaging in direct debate. Debate invites resistance, framing prevents it. If the structure of the situation already points toward the outcome they want, arguing would only risk exposing the structure. Instead, they remain quiet and let your mind walk along the path they highlighted. From your perspective, the decision feels rational. From their perspective, it was predictable. And the most unsettling part is this. Once you accept a framed version of reality, you begin reinforcing it yourself. You notice evidence that supports it. You ignore signals that contradict it. You adjust your behavior to stay consistent with it. The frame becomes self-sustaining even after the manipulator stops actively shaping it. At that point, influence no longer needs maintenance. It has been internalized.
By the time this tactic reaches its final stage, nothing about it looks like manipulation anymore. There is no visible push, no argument, no moment where you feel forced. The structure has already done its work. The frame is set, pressure was never applied, and your own investment has locked the dynamic in place.
Now, the most important shift happens. The influence becomes invisible. You no longer experience the situation as something shaped from the outside. You experience it as something that simply makes sense. Your decisions feel internally consistent. Your behavior feels self-directed. If someone asked why you chose this path, you could explain it clearly. You would point to logic, timing, responsibility, or personal values. Every explanation would feel true because your mind genuinely believes it constructed the decision on its own. This is the moment where the manipulator disappears from the process. Not physically, but psychologically. Their role fades into the background while your reasoning takes center stage. And once you believe a conclusion belongs to you, you defend it differently than you would defend someone else's suggestion. You rationalize it, you reinforce it, you adjust your perception of events to keep it coherent. This is why subtle manipulation is so stable. Direct control creates rebellion once the pressure stops, but influence that feels self-generated continues operating even after the manipulator steps away. The structure remains inside your thinking. You begin interpreting new situations through the same frame. You maintain the same alignment. You keep investing energy in the direction you already moved. Nothing external forces you to do this. Your own sense of consistency does. And the human mind values consistency more than accuracy. Admitting that your choices were shaped from the outside threatens your identity as an independent thinker. So instead of questioning the process, the brain protects the conclusion. It tells you that this is what you wanted all along. It tells you that everything unfolded naturally. It tells you that no one guided you there. That is the final position of control, when influence leaves no trace of itself. At this stage, the manipulator does not need to act. They do not need to remind you, persuade you, or direct you. You have already internalized the path. Your own reasoning sustains it. Your own explanations defend it. Your own behavior reinforces it. And the unsettling truth is that this dynamic is not rare. It exists in workplaces, relationships, institutions, and everyday social interactions. Many people use fragments of it instinctively without ever naming it. Intelligence naturally gravitates toward efficiency, and subtle influence is more efficient than open force. You have likely been on both sides of it. You have been guided without noticing, and at times you have probably guided others the same way, by shaping context, by withholding pressure, by letting them arrive at a conclusion you anticipated. The difference between awareness and ignorance is not whether this tactic exists. It is whether you recognize it while it is happening. Because once you see it clearly, the world looks different. You start noticing how often choices are shaped before they are made. You start noticing how silence can guide behavior more than speech. You start noticing how easily the mind confuses what feels natural with what was carefully arranged. And the realization is not comforting. The strongest control is never loud. It does not demand obedience. It does not need to prove itself. It simply builds a path so convincing that you walk it willingly, believing every step was your own idea.